Hello, this lecture's on Chapter 4, From Periphery to Center, Creating an American Psychology, specifically pages 71 through 80. This is going to take us about halfway through this chapter. This chapter focuses on the competing old psychology and the new experimental psychology that originated from Germany and Europe as a whole. Our first big player that we should talk about is John Witherspoon. He was a minister with the Church of Scotland who brought Scottish common sense to America. Scottish common sense is the idea that stated humans perceive the world directly through our senses, and that this common sense information is the source of accurate knowledge about real things in the world. In other words, Scottish common sense suggested knowledge acquired through observation and experience is superior to knowledge based on reasoning alone. This view claimed to study the God-given faculties of the mind. So this Scottish common sense that John Witherspoon brought to the United States was a precursor to experimental psychology, as it relied on observation rather than reasoning. He was critical of deistic views, which deism is the belief that God designed the universe but did not interfere with day-to-day affairs of humans. Many forward thinkers and students at this time were deist, as well as atheist and materialist. Contradictory to the growing levels of these beliefs, most of the American colleges at the time were affiliated with a Protestant Christian religion. And it's important to note that seminary training, or training with like the clergymen of the church, was required in the sole route to receive a graduate education until research universities started popping up in the United States at the end of the 19th century. But by the 1820s, Scottish common sense and philosophy was the norm in American universities. These courses covered moral and mental philosophy, and usually taught by the president, like John Witherspoon of Princeton. Moral philosophy covered ethics and conduct, and mental philosophy was the elements and processes of the mind and how they influence action. Another important person in this story is Thomas Upham. He attended Andover Theological Seminary and wrote Elements of Intellectual Philosophy in 1827. That textbook is considered the earliest and most influential textbooks on American mental philosophy. His textbook covered ideas that would be of interest for future experimental psychologists. These ideas included sensation and perception, attention, memory, reasoning, emotions, and instincts. American readers enjoyed the inductive reasoning that attempted to find lawful relationships between a body of facts. In 1832, Upham re-released his book with a new title that better reflected the scope of the 495 topics within. That title was Elements of Mental Philosophy. He emphasized the active process of the mind, or the mind in use, which contrasted Wilhelm Wundt's mind as contents idea. Another important person is James McCosh. He was elected president of Princeton in 1868. Claimed evolution was God's doing, because the mental philosophy in pre-Civil War America was still connected to the idea that humans and the human mind were creations of a Protestant God, but the increasingly popular and theory that was gaining evidence was Darwinian evolutionary theory, and research on physiological psychology challenged this view with a materialistic one. Scottish realist James McCosh dealt with the Darwinian theorists by claiming evolution was an example of God's handiwork, and McCosh was interested in the new experimental psychology and pushed his students to further the research in experimental psychology, especially physiological psychology. He was also very influential in implementing laboratory demonstrations of the new psychology in the university setting and encouraged many of his students to pursue experimental psychology, especially physiological psychology. At this time, there were two kinds of psychology. One was an old psychology and then a new psychology that was in conflict with each other. The old psychology was also known as everyday psychology for Americans, which was based largely on religion, phrenology, mesmerism, spiritualism, and New Thought. And new psychology was the scientific psychology that came from Europe. It was led by people with academic credentials and professional experience. So they attended a graduate school and was uh, focused on functionalism. New psychologists saw old psychology as a direct competitor. They argued that their knowledge and methods led to a more successful application to problems facing Americans than any component of old psychology. Through this conflict, indigenization was occurring. Indigenization is the process of a local culture or region developing its own psychology. Indigenization can occur by importing aspects of psychology developed elsewhere and combining them with local concepts. So the importing aspects of psychology from elsewhere was the new psychology that was being imported from Europe, and local concepts was some of the old psychology like religion and spiritualism and New Thought. So the combination of old psychology and new psychology is how we are getting our distinct American psychology. Another important person is Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was an American preacher. During the First Great Awakening, he pushed for religious psychology, and he said religious psychology characterized the soul as an inseparable unity of understanding, will, and affections. Other preachers in his time preached the entire East Coast, resulting in many new Christian believers, as well as a general openness to profound religious experiences. These profound religious experiences would cause people to shout, fall down, have visions, and experience new trance-like behaviors. The physical demonstrations of these religious conversions and personal transformation came to be referred to as the shout tradition, which is part of the old psychology. Franz Anton Mesmer was a physician from Vienna who drew upon the current theories about the influence of various physical forces like the stars and planets and magnets to promote the understanding of health and disease based on the balance of bodily fluids. He also studied what later became known as the mesmeric state or mesmerism. He said the mesmeric state was a deep connection of sympathy between the mesmerist and the subject. People in this state were thought to be capable of physical and intellectual tasks outside their normal capacity. This connection was later thought to simply be a heightened sense of suggestibility. Mesmer was eventually discredited in Vienna and Paris. However, his followers continued to keep his practices and theories alive. One of these followers and students was the person on the right with a name very hard for me to pronounce. But he expanded on Mesmer's ideas and created another sort of old psychology technique or idea known as magnetic somnambulism. Leroy Sunderland was a Methodist preacher who practiced mesmerism and wrote a book titled The Magnet. The Magnet explained religious experiences using a psychological view, or attempted to. He claimed that those in a mesmeric state and the religious experiences of a revival setting, such as the shout tradition, were one and the same. Sunderland became an advocate for abolition of slavery before leaving the Methodist Church in the 1840s. He spent the second half of his life developing his psychological theories and practices. He merged mesmerism with phrenology, uh, and phrenology was very popular for Americans of all classes at the time. Sunderland believed mesmerism was a doorway into the spirit realm and considered it empirical and verifiable proof that the realm existed. He claimed spiritualism allowed people to communicate with the spirit realm, and thus allowed people to communicate with the dead. Spiritualism used new technological advancements, such as the wireless telegraph and X-rays, to explain spiritualist phenomena, simply stating that uh, since these new things that couldn't be seen were being discovered, they thought it was a matter of time before the energy or mechanism behind spiritualism would be discovered. After the Civil War, spiritualism became very popular because so many men were killed, leaving more than 600,000 homes with no adult males or adolescent males. People used spiritualism in an attempt to communicate with their lost loved ones. Phineas P. Quimby was a mesmerist and healer who whose ideas later became the basis of New Thought. And Mary Baker Eddy was a patient of Quimby's who was successfully healed using Quimby's mesmerism, and later founded a Church of Christ Science. A New Thought was the idea that one person's mind could influence another beyond mesmerism to a practice of psychological healing. He believed using this technique would allow himself to see the false belief about a disease that was the true cause of the illness. He said he could correct the false belief so that a person would be healed. Again, another form of old psychology or everyday psychology. And the last person we'll be talking about is William James. William James was a prominent member and later president of the American Society for Psychical Research, or the ASPR. James and the ASPR studied thought transference, hypnotism, telepathy, clairvoyance, and trance states. James argued that since little is known about these states, that people should attempt to study them. James's colleagues saw psychical research as a competitor to the new psychology because the American public could not tell them apart, and all of it was psychology to Americans. New psychologists, those with European training, had to come up with ways to convince the American people, college administrators, and their colleagues that psychology was different than philosophy. This was accompanied by using the experimental methods learned in Germany. Psychologists also distanced themselves away from the traditions of moral and mental philosophy.